Hey everyone, my name is Kevin, and in this video, we're going to create this 2D and 3D animated scene in Blender with Grease Pencil. This is my first tutorial, and it's based off my last video and the Moonflowers video I made a few weeks back, so if you'd like to reference those, I'll leave links in the description below. This tutorial is made mostly for beginners and those somewhat familiar with Blender who want to learn more about this kind of art. I'll be splitting it up into two parts, with this being part 1. There will be 9 steps total. In this video, we'll do a Blender overview for those still starting out, go over modeling and shade our scene. In part 2, we'll do a Grease Pencil overview, then draw and animate the 2D scene elements, then go over camera and exporting. Also, I'm still fairly new to Blender, so if there's something I've missed, or there's a more efficient way to do something, feel free to mention it in the comments. I'll have screencast keys at the bottom left to see what I'm pressing within the program. If you see keys that have OS key in front of a shortcut, it's because I'm on a Mac and that's the command key. Just know you can press Ctrl instead for the same result and vice versa. Lastly, feel free to speed up or slow down the video if needed. Let's start by downloading the program. You can download Blender for free on the official website blender.org. I'm using Blender 2.91. When you first open it up, you'll see these options to create a new file. We can either select one of the options or click outside the box, which will take you to this view. So I'm going to give the overview of how to navigate within the program for those still starting out. But if you're familiar with Blender already, you can skip this part and move to step 1, creating the concept. Before we start, it's important to note that Blender has a lot of information on what each button and function does. If you hover over any button, Blender will bring up a helpful tooltip. The first thing we'll want to do is to figure out how to move in 3D space. If you've never worked in 3D before, in this viewport we have 3 axes to move in: the X, Y, or Z axis. So the green line here is the Y axis, the red line the X axis, and lastly we have the Z axis, which is this blue line that runs from the top to the bottom. Now, to move our view, we can go up to the top right corner of this viewport here and drag this axis wheel to move along them like this. Or you can click on each axis circle and it'll orient you to that view orthographically. But if you want to get out of that, you can just click and drag the axis wheel to move back to the perspective view. Down here, we have this magnifying glass, and dragging allows you to zoom in and out. This hand allows you to shift the view. This camera view is for the camera view of our scene, and right now it's going to the default one already contained in the file, which is here highlighted in yellow. The last option here is orthographic view, and this is actually the view we're taken to once we click on the axis circles here. This view is particularly good in helping to precisely position objects in our scene. Now, a simpler way to move is to use your mouse and keyboard. Holding down your middle mouse button and dragging allows you to rotate. Scrolling with your middle mouse button or pressing Ctrl plus the middle mouse button and dragging allows you to zoom in and out. Shift plus middle mouse button allows you to shift the view. If you have a numpad, there are shortcuts for views as well. And if you don't have a numpad, you can go up to Edit, Preferences, Input, and select Emulate Numpad to make the numbers at the top of your keyboard act like a numpad. Numpad 0 takes you to camera view. Numpad decimal brings you into a focus view of the object that you have selected. For example, when I select my cube, this makes it my active object, denoted by the yellow highlight, and pressing the decimal brings me right up to it. Or when I select the camera object, pressing decimal brings me right up to that. The rest of the numpad numbers correspond with the axis circles we clicked earlier, and the plus and minus buttons zoom in and out by increments respectively. Back up to the top right here, we have more viewport options. Here we can toggle on and off the overlays in the scene and bring up more options by clicking this drop-down arrow to hide or display certain elements, like this floor grid. Next to it, we have X-ray view, which allows us to see through objects. This is helpful when we want to select certain parts of our mesh in our scene. Lastly, we have 4 different viewing modes for our viewport. Notice the cube changing while I click through them. We have Wire Edge mode, Solid mode, Material Preview mode, and Render Preview mode. Basically, these go from less to more detailed in the viewport and will require more processing power accordingly. For a shortcut, you can also hover in the viewport, press Z, and it'll bring up this radial menu for you to select a viewing mode. For now, we'll change it to solid mode. Now, when working with objects in our scene, we also have different modes that we can work in. Take a look at this drop-down that says Object Mode in the top left. This is the mode we're currently in, and this allows us to select different objects in our scene, like our light, our camera, and our cube. But there are actually other modes we can work in. With the cube selected, if we go to this drop-down and select another mode like Edit, more options appear on the left specific to modeling that object, like extruding, beveling, and cutting. But notice how we can't select other objects in our scene while in edit mode, just parts of our selected object. We'll need to go back to object mode, and an easy way to do this is to hit Tab to easily switch between the two. This is one shortcut that we'll be using frequently. Also, it's important to note that there are more modes than just object and edit mode. Going to the drop-down, we have Sculpt, Vertex Paint, etc. If you'd like to switch to another mode, you can either select it from the drop-down list here, or we can hit Control-Tab to select a mode from the radial menu. It's a small detail, but by default, pressing Tab will switch between object and edit mode. However, if you select, let's say, Sculpt mode, Tab will switch between edit and Sculpt mode instead. Let's leave this in object mode for now. Along the top, we have different workspaces. Right now, we're in the Layout workspace, but we also have several other workspaces for modeling, sculpting, shading, etc. Additionally, if we click this plus icon, we can select another workspace from the list depending on what we're working on. As we click through each workspace, notice the layout options and mode change to fit the workspace. For example, with the cube selected, changing the workspace to sculpting changes the layout and mode to sculpting. Going back to the layout workspace, at the bottom, we currently have a timeline here for animation, but clicking on this icon on the top left allows us to change this window to display something else, like a shader editor. We'll change it back to the timeline for now. At the top right here, we currently have our outliner displayed, or the list of items in our scene. You can think of this like a layers panel and other design programs, except things aren't necessarily in layers here, just listed. Currently, you can see we have a camera, a cube, and a light. And just like the last window, we could click this icon on the top left to display something else. Clicking on this icon next to it gives us options to display the list of items differently. We can also search items by name here in the search bar. For example, if I search light, it'll bring up light or objects by that name. The funnel-like icon can filter through object types and toggle visibility options for objects in our scene. The collection icon here allows us to create a new collection, collections being kind of like folders to help with organization and grouping objects. Underneath this, we have our properties panel. I'll walk through these more in depth as we go through the tutorial, but for a rundown, the tool icon are workspace options, depending on what workspace you're in. The icon below it are render properties, and we'll be using Eevee for this one. Under that are output properties like dimensions, length, and file type. Under that are layer properties and scene properties. This globe is our world shader where we can adjust our background like color or adding an HDRI. This orange square icon are the object properties. When an object is selected, we can go to this panel and move the location, rotation, or scale among other options. Below that are modifiers, which are a series of options that let us modify an object. For example, I can add an array modifier and it'll give me an array of that object. We also have particle properties here if we want to add particles to our scene, physics, and object constraint properties, which we won't really cover in this tutorial. We have object data properties here, where we can segment data within an object, which we won't really cover either, material properties, and lastly, texture properties. Now, let's bring your focus to this object here with this red and white circle around it. This is our 3D cursor. We'll be using this quite a lot in this tutorial as it helps to define the starting locations of new objects. Right now, the cursor is at our world origin. Let's select this cube and delete it by either right-clicking and selecting delete, or for a shortcut, with the cube selected, pressing X and selecting delete. So let's try to add a new object at our 3D cursor. We can go up to Add at the top left, go to Mesh, and select Cube. This brings in a new cube at that point. But an easier way is if we delete this by pressing X, then delete, and hit Shift A, that brings up the same menu, but quicker. Let's delete this and try moving our 3D cursor somewhere else. To do that, we can go to the 3D cursor icon on the left, clicking on it, and then if we click anywhere in our scene, the cursor will move accordingly. Let's go back to the select option on the left. For a shortcut, if we hold Shift plus right click, this allows us to move the 3D cursor as well. Let's pick a random position for our cursor and add a new mesh by pressing Shift A to Mesh to Cube. Notice how the cube appears where we place the 3D cursor. Now, to reset the position of the 3D cursor back to the world origin, we can hit Shift S and select the option Cursor to World Origin from the radial menu. So we have the 3D cursor back at the world origin, but now we have a cube that's floating here and we want to place it back at the world origin too. There are a couple of ways we can do this. With the object selected, we can either go to the Object Properties panel, which is again this orange square icon here, and reset everything to 0. Or, by hovering in your viewport, you can tell the viewport is active by this bar highlighted at the top, and pressing shortcut N, then clicking the Items tab to bring up the same options. Or with the object selected, hitting Alt-G to reset the position of the object. Or even quicker, using the 3D cursor itself by hitting Shift-S and picking Selection to Cursor. Now, to precisely move objects in your scene, with the object selected, we can go to the crosshair arrow option on the top left, which is Move, and click on it to enable the movement widgets. Underneath it is the Rotate option with its respective rotation widgets, and the Scale option. You can scale in the X, Y, or Z. We can also click the Transform option underneath those, which have all three at the same time. Let's go back to Select here. The quicker way to do this is with shortcuts. With the object selected, if we hit G to grab, that allows us to grab and move the object. And if we hit either X, Y, or Z after we've grabbed the object, that allows us to constrain the movement to that axis. So here, we're moving along the X, moving along the Y, and moving along the Z. Additionally, if we hit Shift plus that axis, that excludes movement in that specific axis. For example, if I hit G to grab, then Shift X, I'll move the object along the Z or the Y axis. Notice how the X axis is not affected. We can do this with rotating by hitting R with the X, Y, and Z options as well. And lastly, Scale by hitting S along the X, the Y, and the Z. So I mentioned resetting the position of an object with Alt-G earlier. You can also reset the rotation and scale with that shortcut. To demonstrate, I'm going to grab the object with G, scale it with S, and rotate it with R. To reset all of that, I can hit Alt-G, Alt-S, and Alt-R. Now, just a few more things. Let's say you'd like to split this window or just have another window to display something. You can go up to the top right corner of this viewport, and once you see the crosshair, click drag to the left, and that'll duplicate the space. If you'd like to get rid of it, hover until you see the crosshair again, and click drag to the right. And an arrow pointing to the right will pop up, and then the space will merge back into one once you click. If you haven't noticed by now, there's a lot of shortcuts in Blender, and this is great because it's really customizable. If you'd like a list of the shortcuts or to assign different keys, you can go up to Edit, Preferences, and select Key Map. Or you can right-click a button and select Assign Shortcut. There's also a functionality called Quick Favorites too. If you right-click a button and add to Quick Favorites, This places that button in a separate menu. You can bring up that menu at any time by hitting Q. However, quick favorites are specific to the working mode you're in. So if you quick favorite something from edit mode, you won't see it in sculpt mode. Now we move on to step 1, creating the concept. With any kind of creative project I'm working on, I generally start the same way. I always draw out the concept as best I can, kind of like a roadmap. This is extremely important because the more that you can visualize the design on paper, the easier it'll be to go about it. So I start by looking at inspiration and then start creating a concept from there. Here we have the window, table, vase, and flowers. At this point, I'm thinking in my head, I know I want to make this vase and these flowers 3D, but Toon shaded. And these are going to be drawn effects, etc. So now that we have our concept, we'll go to the next step, which is modeling the scene. Going by our concept, we're going to start with modeling the window first. So let's bring in a cube. Hit Shift A, Mesh, then select Cube. Anytime you bring in a mesh, you'll get these options at the bottom left specific to that mesh. However, once you click in the viewport, the options commit to whatever you've entered, so just make sure you're good on the options before you click. So here we have our cube, and again it's placed where we had our 3D cursor. However, notice this orange dot here? This is the origin point for the mesh, not part of the 3D cursor. This means that all transforms to that mesh will be centered around this point. So let's select this cube, hit S to size this down to about here. About 0.1 in the X, Y, and Z in object properties. The intent is to create the bottom part of a window frame with this shape, so that means we'll need to make this longer in the Y. With the cube selected, hit S, then Y to constrain the scale along the Y-axis. Let's make this about 3 grid squares long. And when we're good on length, click to confirm. So we have the bottom of the frame, and now we want to duplicate this mesh for the top. To do this precisely, it might be helpful to adjust our view. Let's go into the X-axis view by clicking on the X in the axis circle. Side note, this is actually the side view, but everything in this tutorial is oriented in this direction. This view allows us to better align our origin points. It's important to note that when you're in this axis view, movement does not happen on the axis that you're viewing it in. So right now, we're on the X-axis view. Therefore, movement only happens along the Z or the Y, like this. So let's select the mesh and duplicate it with Shift D, and hit Z to constrain the movement in the Z axis, to where it's roughly 5 grid squares tall. Click to confirm. So now we have the top and the bottom of our frame, and we want to create the left and the right sides. Let's click on the top mesh, duplicate it again with Shift D, and actually hit Escape to leave it where it is. We'll still have the duplicated mesh selected, but we want to rotate this 90 degrees in the X by either going to the object properties and entering 90 in the X rotation like this, or by hitting R, X to constrain to the X axis, and typing 90, then pressing enter. Let's bring this mesh down by hitting G, then Z to where it's roughly between the top and the bottom of the frame. We want this mesh to fit the distance between the two meshes at the top and the bottom. Let's scale this mesh with S, then Z until it fits. Then shift it over to the left with G, Y, and put it on the left. Let's duplicate it with Shift D, then Y to constrain to the Y, and put it on the right. Zoom in if you need to. So now, we have our window frame. Let's select the 4 meshes to join them into one object. You can either right-click, select, join, or hit Ctrl-J. So now, our frame is one object. The last thing we'll want to do is to apply the transformation on the object. Applying the transformations resets an object's data to the current transformation. We'll need to do this because it'll help with the modifiers we'll be adding later. To do this, click on your object, hit Ctrl-A, and select Apply All Transformations. Notice the object data here resets. Now, we'll want to create the wood within the frame. In the rundown, I mentioned that new objects are created at the 3D cursor. On the inner side at the bottom part of the frame, here, shift right-click to move the 3D cursor on top of it like this. It's important to note that if you shift right-click on any part of a mesh, the 3D cursor will stick to its surface, like that. Let's return it to our original position. Bring in a new cube with Shift-A, Cube. Let's size this down so it fits within the frame. We'll need to make this longer to fit the frame's length, so we could hit S, then Z to lengthen it that way, but what I'd like to do is edit the mesh. Hit Tab to go into edit mode, and at the top next to the drop-down mode list, you'll see 3 options that allow us to select parts of our mesh, which is Vertex Select, Edge Select, and Face Select. The shortcuts are 1, 2, and 3 respectively. If you have Emulate Numpad enabled, unfortunately these shortcuts will not work. Let's hit 3 to enter Face Select for now. Select the top of our mesh, and notice that the top face is highlighted. Let's bring this up to the top of the frame with G and then Z until it fits. I feel like this middle piece is a little too thick, so let's make this thinner. Tabbing to Object Mode, select the mesh, then hit S to scale it down. However, we want to restrict scaling it in the Z, so hit Shift Z to scale it down only in the X and the Y, and make adjustments as needed. Notice how the origin point is at the bottom of the shape? Let's reset the origin point to fit the mesh better. Select the mesh, right-click, select Set Origin, and then Origin to Geometry. The origin point moves to the center of the mesh. Now, let's make pieces running between the frame horizontally. Select the middle of the mesh and duplicate it with Shift-D, and hit Escape. We're going to rotate this by 90 degrees along the X by pressing R, X, typing 90, then hitting Enter. This piece seems a little long, so let's hit S, then Y to shorten it. Let's bring this up with G and then Z until it's about a third of the frame. Let's duplicate it with Shift-D, then hit Z to bring it back down to the middle and click to confirm. We'll want to make a third piece at the bottom half, but instead of Shift-D, we can hit Shift-R to duplicate another mesh at the same distance. I'm going to select these 3 and shift them up a bit with G and then Z to fit better. Let's select our wood pieces and join them with Ctrl-J and apply the transformation with Ctrl-A. We'll also want to put the frame and the wood pieces into a new collection. With these selected, hit M and choose New Collection. Type Window and click OK. So now we have our window. With the 2 still selected, move it back in the X with G and then X. The next thing we'll do is create our table. In the viewport, hit Shift-S and select Cursor to World Origin to reset our 3D cursor. Now, let's bring in a cylinder. Shift-A, Mesh, then Cylinder. Just like when we brought in our cubes, we have options on the bottom left. We'll leave them at the default for now. Click in the viewport to confirm. Click your mesh and hit S, then Z to scale this down in the Z until we get a good thickness. This is going to be our tabletop. Let's make the radius a little bit larger with S, but hit Shift-Z to restrict scaling it in the Z. Let's bring it up by hitting G then Z to where it's right above the third wood piece in the window. We can also go into X-axis view to help. So now I want to add a bit more detail to this table. So with the mesh selected, hit Tab to go into edit mode, then go into face select mode by hitting 3. I want to select the top and bottom faces of this cylinder. Select the top and shift click the bottom face to select them at the same time. Hitting shift and clicking enables selecting multiple objects. So now we have the top and the bottom face selected. I want to extrude these out from the top and bottom respectively. So let's hit E and move it out. Now, it doesn't seem to be extruding the way that we want it to. Let's undo that with Ctrl Z. The reason is because we need to adjust the pivot point of transformation. Go up to this icon with the two rings, click it and hit individual origins. Now, when we hit E, it extrudes it correctly. Extrude it to where it's a little bit above the original height, then click. With the faces still selected, press S to scale them in, and click. Then, press E to extrude a bit again, click to confirm. Your table should look like this. Now, I want to bevel these edges, but first, we'll need to apply the transformation on this mesh. Hit Tab to go back into object mode. Hit Ctrl A, and select Apply All Transformations. Now, hit Tab to go back into edit mode. I want to bevel these two inner edges to style them. Go into Edge Select mode by hitting 2. Let's select this edge right here. So I want to select this whole ring around the mesh, and we can do that by loop selecting. Hold down Alt and click. It'll highlight the entire edge around the mesh. But I also want to select the edge under the table. To do that, hold down Shift to enable selecting multiple parts, Alt to enable loop select, and click. With the two rings selected, let's bevel them by hitting Ctrl B, and if on a Mac, it's Command B, to where we get this slant in the edges. Click to confirm. Notice at the bottom left, bevel options pop up. Let's increase the segments so we get a nice curve. 5 should be fine. Click in the viewport to confirm. So now we have a tabletop. Next, I want to create a table peg for it. While in edit mode, hit 3 to enter face select mode and click the bottom face. Hit E as if you were going to extrude, but instead of moving it, press S and scale in the geometry like this to create a smaller circle. With the middle face still selected, hit E to extrude it downward in the Z. Hit Tab to go back into object mode, and then Ctrl A to apply the transformation. So now we have a table. Going up to the outliner, let's rename this Table, and if it's in the wrong collection, be sure to move it out. The next thing we'll do is model a vase. First, I want to position the 3D cursor on the surface of this table. So let's go into the top view by hitting the Z-axis symbol here or hitting numpad 7. Shift right-click in the same spot to move the 3D cursor onto the table surface. Again, if you shift right-click on any mesh surface, the 3D cursor will stick to it. So with the cursor in the correct position, let's bring in another cylinder. So Shift A, Mesh, and then Cylinder. However, in the options at the bottom left, change the number of vertices to 48. Click to confirm. Hit S to size this down significantly to about here. Now G, then Z to bring it up. I want this vase to be a little taller, so hit S, then Z to scale it in the Z. Bring it up with G, then Z if you need to. This looks like a good height. With the object selected, hit Tab for edit mode, face select by hitting 3, and click this top face to select it. Press S to scale it out and click to confirm. With it still selected, press E to extrude it upward, and click, then S to scale it in, click, then E to extrude it upward again, click, then E, and then S to scale the top face in, click to confirm, and then E to extrude it downward. Make adjustments as needed. So now we have a rough looking vase. Tab out to object mode, then apply all transformations with Ctrl A. We want to bevel these two edges, so tab back into edit mode, edge select by hitting 2, then Alt plus click this edge here to select the ring around the vase. Then Shift, Alt, and click this edge here. With the ring selected, Ctrl or Command B to bevel them. Now the vase appears softer and more fluid. Tab out to object mode and Ctrl A to apply the transformations on the object. Go up to the outliner, rename the object Vase, and if it's in the wrong collection, move it out. if you want to make some transformation adjustments, right-click the vase and set origin to geometry, then scale as needed. So now we have our window, table, and vase. Let's move on to modeling our flowers. So we have two types of flowers in this scene that will be in 3D. We're going to start with a simpler, daisy-like one. To give us some space, let's hide the current objects in our scene right now. We can go up to the outliner and click the eye icon to hide them. Or you can select an object in the viewport and hit H for the shortcut. Hit Shift S and reset the cursor to the world origin. Let's bring in a mesh plane with Shift A and then plane. Hit S to scale and then Y to make it thinner. Tab into edit mode and hit Ctrl or Command R to enter loop cut. A yellow line appears right in the middle of the plane. Click twice to confirm that position. Now, enter vertex select by hitting 1 and select these two vertices and bring them closer to each other with S and then Y. Now, select these two vertices at the other end and bring them in, even closer, kind of like a petal shape. Let's shift the view to the top by pressing Z on the axis wheel or hitting numpad 7. Tab into object mode, then hit G, then X to move the object to the left so that the 3D cursor lines up with the right edge of the mesh. Now, right-click the mesh and set origin to 3D cursor. So now its origin is on the right of the mesh. We're going to duplicate this 4 times in a circle so that there's 5 petals in total in our flower. With the mesh selected, hit Shift D to duplicate, then R to rotate. Rotate until it's right next to the original petal, then click to confirm. Then hit Shift R to duplicate 3 more times. Then adjust the rotation of each so they're evenly spaced out. Now, select all the meshes and tab into edit mode. Go into vertex select mode with 1 and select all the middle vertices here. Press G, then Z to bring it down to about here. And click. It'll look a little clunky, but just go with it. Hit S to scale them in, and click, and then tab out to object mode. With the meshes still selected, Ctrl A to apply all transformations. Now we're going to add a subdivision surface modifier. This will give us the curvature we're looking for. So we can go to the wrench icon here and add modifier subdivision surface. But the shortcut while in the viewport is hitting Ctrl or Command and then a number, in this case 2. At the bottom left, you'll notice the subdivision options and notice level 2. The 2 in the shortcut was indicating the amount of levels, and the higher you go, the more detailed the mesh. For this, we can leave it at 2. With the petals still selected, join them into one object with Ctrl J. Now, we'll want to add some thickness to the petals. Let's add a solidify modifier and move it to the top of the subdivision surface modifier. Play with the thickness options. I'm going to make mine about 0.12. With the mesh selected, go to the Modifiers tab and apply the modifiers by going to this dropdown and selecting Apply, or while hovering in the panel, hitting Ctrl A. Now, let's bring in a UV sphere. Shift A, Mesh, then UV sphere. Size accordingly by pressing S. Click G to grab, then Z to bring it down to the center of the flower. Now, select all the meshes that make up the flower, right-click, and select Shade Smooth. Then, put them in a collection by pressing M, New Collection, and naming it Flower 1. Now, we'll move on to the more complicated rose-like flower, so let's hide Flower 1 for now. I won't go into too much detail about grease pencil just yet, not until the next part of the tutorial. I'll go through these steps just for the purposes of modeling the rose. Let's go up to the workspace bar and press the plus button. Go down to 2D Animation Workspace and select 2D Animation. In this workspace, hit Shift A and add a new grease pencil blank. Now, there's a few things we'll need to set up first. Make sure that you're in solid mode here. Next, go to this Overlays dropdown and check 3D Cursor and Canvas. Bring the canvas opacity to about 0.7. Then go to the Object Mode dropdown on the top left and select Draw Mode. Go to the drawing plane option near the top center of your viewport here and change it from View to Top. Now, go into the Properties panel. Click on the Object Data Properties tab, which is this green squiggly icon. Create a new layer and make sure to uncheck Use Lights. Then go down to Material Properties under it, which is this red checkered icon. And select New and leave the options as is. Up where it says Radius, enter 50 pixels and uncheck Use Pressure. Right next to it, bump up the strength to 1 and uncheck Use Pressure. So now, let's enter top view by hitting the Z on the axis wheel or numpad 7. From the drawing options on the left, select the circle icon and shift-click drag from the top left to the bottom right of the grid. Holding shift will make sure that you create a proportional circle. Press enter to confirm. Now, imagine you're looking at the top of a rose. We're going to draw curved lines within this circle to emulate petals. So let's go to the layers in the Object Properties panel and create a new layer by clicking this plus icon. Rename it Petals and make sure to uncheck Use Lights. And let's name this layer under it Guide and take down the opacity to 0.5. Click this padlock next to it to lock the layer. Click on the Petals layer to make sure it's the active layer and then click on the Draw tool on the top left. Now, let's start drawing curved lines within the circle to emulate petals like this. If it helps, while in the top view, you can press 4 or 6 on the numpad to rotate it. This is definitely much easier if you have a drawing tablet. However, if you're using a mouse, you can hold down Shift and it'll bring you into a pulled string mode to help control the stroke better. We also have advanced smoothing options and stroke smoothing options up here, but we'll cover those later. It doesn't need to be perfect, some randomness is great, just make sure the strokes aren't too close together. After you filled up the circle, let's go to our Layers panel and unlock the guides, and delete it by pressing the minus button. We're going to switch over to the Layout workspace. Doing this will put us in Object mode. With the grease pencil layer selected, right-click and select Convert to Polygon Curve. Notice how a new curve object is created in our outliner. Hide the grease pencil object by selecting it and then hitting H. Select the new curve, and now we'll need to simplify these lines in our curve object, and we could do that by using an add-on. Go up to Edit, Preferences, and then select Add-ons. Search for Simplify Curves Plus, and then check the box to enable it. Now, we can use that add-on using the search function. If you have an F3 key, you can hit it and it'll bring up the search bar. But if you don't or are on a Mac like me, you can temporarily make your spacebar enable the search bar. Go up to Edit, Preferences, Key Map, and change the spacebar action to search. However, once we use the search in a bit, just make sure to change it back to play. Now exit out of the options. With the curve object still selected, go to Search, Curve Simplify, and in the options at the bottom left, increase the error until there are about 1 to 2 vertices in between each curves, around 0.03 or 0.04. Click to confirm. By doing this, another curve object is created called Simple plus the name of your original curved object. Let's hide the original curved object by selecting it and hitting H. Now, with our simple curve selected, right-click and click Convert to Mesh. The curve object changes to a mesh object. Now, let's tab into Edit mode and hit 1 to enter vertex select. With this flower, I want the middle part to come up higher than the rest. To do that, select any vertex near the middle of the mesh. At the top here, click this target-looking icon called Proportional Editing. This allows you to affect the surrounding vertices while you transform the one you have selected. With a vertex selected, hit G, then Z, and raise it slightly higher. If needed, feel free to go into a side view by hitting X on the axis circle, and use your mouse wheel to increase or decrease the size of effect of the proportional editing. Click to confirm. Let's turn off proportional editing by hitting shortcut O. Going back to the top view by hitting Z on the axis circle or numpad 7, I want to add some differentiation in the petal heights. While holding Shift, select random vertices within each curve. Now, enter a side view and hit G, then Z to move those vertices up. Now, we get more rigid lines. While still in side view, select all the vertices by pressing A, and we're going to extrude these. But before we do, make sure your transformation pivot point is set to medium point at the top right here. Hit E, then Z to extrude down. Click to confirm. Notice how the bottom vertices are also uneven like the top? To fix this, hit S, then Z, and then 0, and enter to make them level. Press S to scale them in a bit. Then E, then Z again, and then click, and S to scale them in further, then click. We're trying to create a bowl shape. So E and then Z again, S to scale them in and click, and then finally E, then Z again, and then S to scale them in until they touch. So it looks a little uneven, and if you want to edit the radius of any one of these segments, click Alt-Z to enter X-ray mode, or click this icon at the top right here. Then, select this vertices row here and press S to scale them out or in. The reason we use X-ray is to make sure we capture the vertices at the back of the mesh. Make the adjustments you need, and then after, exit out of X-ray mode with Alt-Z. So now, when we're happy with our mesh, we're going to apply a subdivision surface modifier to smooth it out. Tab to Object Mode and hit Ctrl 2, and now we have something resembling a flower. Let's thicken this up by adding a Solidify modifier. Make sure it's on top of the subdivision surface modifier in the panel. Play with the thickness or offset until you get a result you're satisfied with. I'm bumping my offset to 1 and my thickness to about 0.08. Now, I want to make a few edits to my flower to give it some diversity. Tab into Edit mode, and make sure you're on Vertex Select by hitting 1. Turn on Proportional Editing by pressing O, and start pulling up some vertices with G and then Z to give it some variety. When you're satisfied, tab back into Object Mode. Right-click on the object and select Shade Smooth. Now, let's go to our Outliner panel and unhide the original Grease Pencil object and original Curve object. Shift-select both of them and move them into a new collection by hitting M, New Collection, typing extras, and clicking OK. Then uncheck this box to hide. This is in case you want to revisit these. Let's also duplicate the flower mesh we just made with Shift-D, then Escape, and add it to the New Extras collection as well by hitting M, Extras. Let's rename our flower mesh to Flower 2. With Flower 2 selected, go to your Modifiers panel. We're going to apply all the modifiers on this mesh with Ctrl A. Let's unhide the table, vase, and window. Now I want to start placing the flowers in our scene. So click on Flower 2 mesh, right-click, and set Origin to Geometry. Scale this down with S to about here. Then bring it up to the top of the vase with G and Z. Then rotate it in the Y with R, then Y until it's facing forward. Then click. I'm going to rotate it in the Z as well to face a bit to the left. Once we have Flower 2 in position, unhide the Flower 1 collection. Right-click the collection and go to Select Objects. Press S to scale them down to a reasonable size and position the flower to your liking. Now, I want to duplicate this flower and make it smaller. Shift-D to duplicate, then Y to move along the Y. I want to rotate it, so hit R, then Z, twice to make sure you rotate in its local axis. Then click. Press S and size down. Then make other necessary adjustments and position accordingly. So now that we have our flowers in position, we'll need to add the stems. To do that, shift the view to the back of the flower heads and shift right-click the backside of flower 1. We're going to bring in a Bezier curve. So hit Shift-A, go to Curve, and then select Bezier curve. Notice how it brings this line here. Go to the Object Data Properties at the bottom right, this curved green line. Under Geometry, inside Bevel, increase the depth so we can see it clearer to around 0.015. This Bezier curve acts very similar to Adobe's Pen tool if you've ever used that, except with Blender's transformation controls. Tab into Edit mode and make sure we have proportional editing turned off. And let's select this vertex here and bring it back with G and then X until it lines up with the back of the flower. Let's also scale this down with S to shorten the Bezier handle. So now we're going to select the other point and bring it down with G, Z. Bring it in with GX and then GY to where the point is inside the vase. Scale and rotate the curve accordingly. So now we have the first stem. We can duplicate this to create the stem for the other flowers. Tab into Object mode and hit Shift-D, Y to shift it over. Tab into Edit mode and select the vertex at the top. Line it up with the back of the other flower with GY and then GX. Then make adjustments. So to keep organization, tab into Object mode. Let's shift-click those two curves in our outliner, press M, and put them in the Flower 1 collection in case they aren't already. Now select this curve and let's duplicate it for the last flower. Then adjust the position and the scale as needed. For this stem, I want it to be a little bit thicker, so let's increase the depth of the curve in the data properties to about 0.018. Let's shift select the Flower 2 mesh and its stem, press M to add a new collection and type Flower 2. Click OK. So now we have our 3D elements modeled. Let's move on to shading. For this scene, we're going to be using a limited color palette. To help, we can actually go to Adobe Color at color.adobe.com. You don't need an account for this. When you open the page, you'll notice they have different color rules to generate a palette on the left. You can also explore ideas and trends at the top. Although I love vibrant colors, I'm not the best at it when it comes to harmonizing, so this tool helps a lot. In the Golden Flowers piece I made, I actually used split complementary, with the main color being a sort of maroon, and the other two being yellow and a dull blue/purple. To be honest, I'm not really rigid on this, it just helps to have an idea of what colors I want to use for my scene. Once you have a palette you're happy with, we can head back into Blender. Before we shade the scene, we'll want to go into the Render Properties tab here and go down to Color Management, change Filmic to Standard. This is because we'll be going for a more Toon shaded look instead of realistic. Up at the Workspace bar, hit the Shading workspace and make sure the viewport is in Render Preview mode. So first, we're going to change the background. Down here in the shader window, you can actually move around like you would in the viewport. Go up to this drop down here and select World. You'll see we have two nodes, a background and a world output. Anything that plugs into our output will be displayed in our scene. We're going to make a gradient-like background. Let's bring in a gradient texture node with Shift-A, click Search, and type in Gradient Texture. Click to drop it in. To help adjust colors, let's bring in a color ramp with the same method. Shift-A, click Search, type Color Ramp one word, and click to drop it in. Plug in the gradient node's color into the color ramp's FAC or factor by clicking and dragging on those dots. Connect the color ramp's color and background's color nodes. As a shortcut, you can press Alt, right-click drag to connect the same color points. So now, the background just looks black, but if you shift the view, you'll notice there's a vertical gradient on the right. So we want to align this with our camera view. Let's bring a mapping node with Shift-A, search Map, and click on Mapping. Connect its output vector with the gradient texture vector, then bring in a texture coordinate node with Shift-A, search Texture Coordinate, and click. Connect the camera output in the texture coordinate to the mapping vector, and now the gradient lines up with our camera view. Another way to do this is with Node Wrangler. an add-on which is used pretty frequently. Go up to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and search Node Wrangler, and click the checkbox to enable it. Once enabled, select the texture coordinate and mapping nodes and press X to delete. Click on the gradient texture node and press Ctrl-T to add the same nodes we just deleted. However, make sure that the camera and texture coordinate is connected to the mapping vector instead. So going to this background node, try to adjust the strength. Notice as more of the white is seen in the background gradient, the brighter the 3D elements become. I'd like to separate that effect so we can have a vibrant background and control the effect it has on 3D objects. This is important because the object shader we'll create will be affected by light sources. Let's bring in a mix shader with Shift-A, search Mix Shader, and then click. Then drop it on the connection noodle between background and world output. A connection is automatically created between the two. Let's bring in a light path node. Shift-A, search Light Path, and click to confirm. Now connect camera ray to the mix shader factor. Our gradient is now gone, but when you try to adjust the strength of this background node, only the objects get brighter. And if we change the connection to this shader at the bottom, our gradient comes back and adjusting the strength does not affect the 3D objects. Let's move the connection back to the first shader slot. Duplicate the background node with Shift-D and connect the color ramp and mix shader to it by Alt plus click dragging. Now we've separated the light intensity on the background and on the objects. In the top background node, let's change the strength to 3 for now. The next thing I want to do is to orient the gradient in the correct direction. Go to the mapping node and in the Z rotation, type in -90, and in the X rotation, type in -30. This orients the gradient from top to bottom and softens it as well. Now let's change the colors of our background. I'm going to go with sunset colors, like in the Golden Flowers video. Head into our color ramp, and let's bring these handles closer together. Now, the gradient looks a little bit jarring, so let's change the mode from linear to B-spline. I know I want this left marker to be a yellow, so let's click to select it, click on this block of color to bring up a color wheel, and find something light yellow. Then, click on the right marker. Click the block of color, and find something darkish purple. I want to add some warm tones here, so with the right marker selected, let's click this plus icon, and it brings up a new marker in between the two. With the middle marker selected, click the block of color, and pick some sort of bright red-orange color. This looks better, but I want to add more detail. With the middle marker selected, press the plus button again. I want to make this a brighter yellow-orange. And with the purple marker selected, press the plus button and make this something redder. This is to make a nice gradual sunset gradient. Let's adjust the position of the markers accordingly and color of the markers as needed. So I ended up shifting the markers down a bit so that we got more of that darker purple at the top, and made some color adjustments as well. Now we're going to move on to shading the objects. Click the world dropdown and select Object. Let's select the vase in our viewport. Up here at the center, let's click New to create a new material. Let's rename this Main Color. And down here, you'll notice we have two nodes, a principled BSDF and a material output. We'll want to create some sort of Toon shader from this. Hit Shift-A and search Shader to RGB, then drop it on the connection noodle here. Then bring in a color ramp with Shift-A and drop it on the connection noodle between the shader to RGB node and the material output. It doesn't look like anything's changed, but if we change the option from linear to constant, you'll see a sharp transition from black to white. However, it looks a little pixelated, so with the vase selected in our scene, let's right-click and select Shade Smooth. If we adjust the white marker position, we'll notice the color moves. However, I want more control over this, so let's bring in a separate RGB node and drop it on the connection noodle between shader to RGB and color ramp. The R or red node in separate RGB automatically connects to the factor of the color ramp. Now it looks like the color just shifted slightly, so let's bring in a mix RGB node and drop it in between the color ramp and the material output. Let's move the color ramp node to the FAC of the mix RGB instead of color 1. It's all gray right now, but let's change color 1 and color 2 in the mix RGB node to random colors. Now adjust the color ramp connected to it. Notice how we can shift the color coverage with these markers. So now I'd like to duplicate this color ramp and mix RGB setup for the G and the B outputs. Let's select these two and hit Shift D and drag it underneath, and click. Then let's duplicate the setup again and drag it underneath that, and click. Now connect the G and separate RGB to the second color ramp factor, and B and separate RGB to the third color ramp factor. Now, connect the second mix RGB color output to the color 2 input in the first mix RGB, like this. Then, connect the third mix RGB color output to the color 2 input in the second mix RGB, like this. So this is what your setup should look like. Now, let's make all the color inputs on the mix RGBs different colors to help with the next step. So now we have this weird color shader. Let's adjust the color ramp markers of the R, G, and B channels until we get the color coverage we want. Once we're satisfied, let's pick colors according to our palette to replace the random colors that we picked. So I want this to be a light yellow, and this will be a brighter spot in the shader, and then it'll gradually go darker. So this color will be a light yellow, this will be kind of a golden color, and this will be an orange-ish color, and this will be a maroon. Adjust them until you're satisfied. Now that this part's done, we can apply this shader to the rest of the objects in our scene. To do this easily, let's select this table and shift-click the vase to make it the active object. Then, hit Ctrl L to make a link and select Material. This applies the vase material to the table. Just make sure when you do this, the mesh you want to copy the material from is selected last. Just like our vase, the table looks a little choppy, so select the table, right-click, and shade smooth to fix it. Looking at this now, I want more of that maroon to show, so let's go into our world shader and decrease the strength of the top background shader to 2.3. Again, because this shader is affected by light, you can actually use the lights in your scene for color adjustments as well. For example, if I grab this light and move it closer, notice how the gradients move with it. However, with the light selected, or any lights that you add, just make sure to uncheck shadows in the Object Data Properties panel. This will prevent some unwanted color shading. Also, this current light is at 1000 watts. Now, I want to apply this shader to the rest of the objects in the scene. So again, shift-click multiple objects and make sure the one with the material I want to copy from is selected last. Then, Ctrl L to make links and select material. Let's select all the elements in the window, then the vase, then Ctrl L to link the materials. Now we have the whole scene colored, but we want to add an outline around each object. To do this, let's select all the objects in our scene and apply the transformation with Ctrl A, just in case we haven't done so. Click on the rows and create a new material by going into the Material Properties panel and pressing this plus button in the list. Click New to create a new material and rename it Outline. Going to the shader editor, make sure this dropdown is set to Object. Let's delete the principled BSDF by pressing X. Bring in an emission shader with Shift A, search emission, and click to confirm. Change the color to black for now, then Alt-click drag to the material output surface. In the Material Properties tab, make sure that backface culling is checked. Now, to apply this material as an outline, let's go to the Modifiers tab and add a Solidify modifier. Go to Normals, check Flip, then go down to Materials, and in Material Offset, type 1 to correspond with the new material we just made, meaning the material under the original material. Now, we'll see an outline around the flower. Let's adjust the thickness to be -0.01 or until you're happy with it. Now we can apply this to the rest of the objects in our scene. We can do that using the same technique as linking the materials. Click the table, then shift-click the flower head, press Ctrl+L, and select the modifiers and repeat for materials again. The thing is, you might need to adjust the thickness on the solidify modifier for each mesh. Like this table outline is a little too thin. Also, sometimes this could be due to not having applied the transformation on the object. Just make sure to double check. Let's apply the modifier and materials to the vase and adjust as needed. Shift select the stems, then apply the modifiers and materials and adjust as needed. For these flowers, let's actually join the sphere and petals by shift selecting and then Ctrl-J to join. Same thing with the other flower, Ctrl-J to join. Then, shift select both of the flowers and apply the modifier and materials on it. For the window, let's select the wood and frame objects and Ctrl-J to join. Then, apply the modifier and materials with Ctrl-L and adjust as needed. I'm aiming to have some even thickness between all of them. So now I want to make this outline a different color. Down here in the shader editor, we can change the emission color to something else, something lighter perhaps. You can make this any color you want, but I want to go with a dark reddish purple. Notice how all the strokes are changing. This is because they all share the same material. Looking at this, I want to make a new color for the vase and frame. With the vase selected, let's go into the Material Properties tab and select Main Color. Click this paper icon to create a new material from this one. It will duplicate Main Color. Let's rename this Secondary Color. And let's go into our shader editor. I kind of want to make this a light orange/beige color, so I'll adjust those colors accordingly. Let's apply this material to the window frame with Ctrl-L. And now we have our scene shaded. Make all the adjustments you need. This is the end of part 1. In part 2, we'll cover grease pencil and we'll walk through how to achieve the 2D effects in this scene.